Not long ago, I was watching a video on C-SPAN. It was about the first Africans in Virginia, and the presentation was by this fellow, Rick Murphy. And as you can see, he's got some good credentials, and that's his book. And he's won a lot of awards for his work, so he seemed like a good fellow to pay some attention to. And he made some statements in his presentation that were they really caught my attention. I was kind of shocked. And I was sufficiently curious that after I watched the video, I decided to research some of what he had to say. And that's why I did this video. This is kind of how I do research. So I will play you a very short segment of his presentation, and you'll probably see what I mean.
Now, did you know why European nations felt that they had ownership over Africa and South America and other parts of the world? The Pope told them that in the Treaty of Society. Now, Spain and Portugal were on the same Iberian Peninsula. Like family, they didn't get along, and they were exploring around the world, and they kept bumping into each other. They were going to go to war, and the Pope knew that that would be a disaster. So he divided the world in half. And he said to Spain, you have West, Portugal, you have East. And this is an example how the Pope divided the world. And that's why Portugal, during the early period of the colonial era, believed that it owned Africa and everything there, including the people.
So he's asking the question, why did the European nations think they had ownership over Africa and South America? And his answer is, because the Pope told them so. And in the process of creating this treaty, the Pope divided the world in half. And he gave half of it to Spain and half of it to Portugal. And that's what got my attention, is that the very idea that the Pope thought he could do that. I mean, it's a reflection of the power of the church in the Middle Ages, but also the arrogance of it is just breathtaking. But then what's even more amazing to me is that at least some people in the world took him seriously. So I wanted to find out about this Pope and about this whole situation of dividing the world up. And so I did some research, and one thing led to another, and it turned into kind of an interesting story, at least for me. So if you will stay with me for a few minutes, I'll tell you the story. So who was this Pope? Well, there's this painting, Pope Julius II. And you have to admit, he's a happy-go-lucky looking fellow. But in reading about him a little bit, he was not your average pope. He was one of the most powerful and influential popes. They nicknamed him the Warrior Pope or the Fearsome Pope. And interestingly enough, he took his papal name in honor of Julius Caesar. So he named himself after a Roman emperor. So that kind of tells you where his head was at. So he's the Pope who brokered the negotiations between Portugal and Spain, and then he ratified this treaty of Tordesillas. In that same year, he made a couple other pretty significant moves. He started the Vatican museums, and he initiated the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, both of which are pretty amazing. And last but not least, in 1508, he's the guy who hired Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So he was a mover and a shaker. And if you're old enough to remember this movie or you saw it on a rerun, there was a pretty good movie made about this relationship between Pope Julius II and Michelangelo called The Agony and the Ecstasy. So that's who he was portraying as the Pope in this little story of mine. So where is this line? Well, here's the deal with the line. So Christopher Columbus goes from Spain over to the Caribbean islands. He claims this land for Spain. But about the same time, the Portuguese, they're sailing down the coast of Africa. And in the process, they discover these little islands. So the Pope draws the line halfway between these islands. And that's why it is where it is. Now, like I said, some people took this seriously, at least the Spanish and the Portuguese did, because this is how their empires came to be in the next 100 years or so. The red territory all was claimed by Spain. The blue territories all claimed by Portugal. Now, what Portugal was interested in was the spice trade of India, very lucrative trade. So they spent a good deal of time trying to get around the Horn of Africa, which was no easy task. And the first fellow who did it, Vasco da Gama, they finally did make it to India and became very successful with the spice trade. Now, not surprising, the indigenous people of the world did not care about this treaty. They did not acknowledge this treaty. They probably didn't even know about this treaty. But as the legal foundation for the discovery doctrine, that's a really important statement. It became the legal foundation for the discovery doctrine, and it's been the source of ongoing tension regarding land ownership into modern times. So what is the doctrine of discovery? Well, it was used by European monarchies in order to legitimize the colonization of lands outside of Europe. Between the mid-15th century and the mid-20th century, this idea has allowed European entities to seize lands inhabited by indigenous people under the guise of discovering new land. Christian governments from Europe could lay title to non-Christian territory on the basis that the colonizers traveled to the new territory and are said to have discovered it. So there's an artist's conception of Cortez meeting Montezuma in Mexico. So this was a European doctrine established around 1500. But by 1792, our Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, claimed that the European doctrine of discovery was international law, which was applicable to the new U.S. government as well. So we took this in. The doctrine was eventually incorporated into U.S. law. 3 important cases came before the United States Supreme Court. So this is a key part of my little story here, is that we embraced this European doctrine. So the first of these 3 Supreme Court cases was the Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia, and it was in 1831. Now, before I talk about this court case, I want to just say a word about the Cherokee Nation at that time, because it'll give you a little context for what's going on here. So here's a map of some of the territories of Indian nations in the southeast United States. There's the Cherokee Nation. And I mean, we all know the story very well of Native American tribes fighting against the white culture. But there were a few tribes who took the opposite approach and decided on assimilation. If we can't beat them, let's join them. And these 5 tribes in the southeast came to be known later as the 5 civilized tribes. So at the time when this case came before the Supreme Court, the Cherokee had already adopted many aspects of white culture. They dressed like whites. They owned prosperous farms and cattle ranches. Some were even slave owners. They had a written language. They published their own newspaper. Some of their kids attended missionary schools. And they had a written constitution founding their nation in 1827. So it was 4 years before this case came before the court. Now here's a photo of members of the Cherokee Nation. Now this photo had to be later than 1831, because I don't think you could take a picture like that in 1831, but it tells you or gives us an idea of the degree of assimilation of some of the Cherokee people, many of them. And this is kind of a sidelight, but if you're talking about the Cherokee Nation, you just have to mention this man. This is a painting of a man named Sequoyah, and in 1821, he independently created the Cherokee syllabary. Now, it wasn't exactly an alphabet. It was called a syllabary, but it made possible reading and writing in Cherokee. His achievement was one of the few times in recorded history that a member of pre-literate people created an original, effective writing system. And that's what allowed the Cherokee Nation to be one of the first in the United States to have a written language. And another side note, but it's worth it to me, Johnny Cash wrote a song about Sequoyah. Now, it's not exactly a song, it's a narration set to music, and it tells the story of Sequoyah. And the song is called The Talking Leaves, and it's on that album. And to me, at least, it's one of his finest pieces of work. So I say that just to give some context to who these people were when they brought this case before the Supreme Court in 1831. So what happened? Well, they brought this case, but the Supreme Court would not hear the case. It ruled that the court had no original jurisdiction in the matter, as the Cherokees were a dependent nation with a relationship to the United States like that of a ward to its guardian. And now, Chief Justice William Johnson, a member of the court, he wrote this as part of the opinion. And it gives you an idea of how far out of touch he was with who the Cherokee people were. He wrote that the rules of nations would regard Indian tribes as nothing more than wandering hordes, held together only by ties of blood and habit, and having neither rules nor government beyond what is required in a savage state. Wow. So they brought this all the way to the court, and they wouldn't hear it. A bummer for the Cherokee Nation. Well, the very next year, another case came before the court involving the Cherokee Nation. This time, the court decided to hear it. And this time, they ruled that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign. And according to this decision, that meant that Georgia had no right to enforce state laws in Cherokee territory. Wow, that's exactly what they were looking for. So that should have been a big win. So then what happened? Well, President Andrew Jackson responded to that decision by saying, "They've made their decision, now let them enforce it." And he refused to enforce it. And in fact, he not only refused it, he ordered the expulsion of the Cherokee Nation. And this hideous decision led to this awful story, which has come to be called the Trail of Tears. So the entire Cherokee Nation was uprooted from their homeland and forced to walk to Oklahoma. In some cases, the U.S. Army was used to just round them up and force them out. Of the 15,000 who left, 4,000 died on the journey to the so-called Indian Territory in Oklahoma. So that was the result of the second court decision. That very same year, a third case came before the Supreme Court that involved the Cherokee Nation. They heard this case. Chief Justice John Marshall found that ownership of land comes into existence by virtue of the discovery of that land, a rule that had been observed by all European countries with settlements in the New World. So our Supreme Court looked back to the year 1500 to this original idea of discovery equaling ownership. The tribes which occupied the land were, at the moment of discovery, no longer completely sovereign and had no property rights, but rather merely held a right of occupancy. And the Supreme Court's decision in this case was unanimous. So we incorporated this idea, the doctrine of discovery, into our legal system as a legal precedent. And the doctrine was cited again by the Supreme Court as recently as 2005. Writing for the majority, Ruth Bader Ginsburg stated that, under the doctrine of discovery, ownership to the lands occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign, first the discovering European nation, and later the original states, and then the United States. Someone as serious as Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote an opinion like that. So this is the doctrine of discovery. And so let me see if I got this straight. So you've got indigenous people who've been living in their homeland for hundreds of years, sometimes even thousands of years. And then a ship sails in, and a stranger appears on the shore, and he sticks a flagpole in the ground, and somehow now the land belongs to him, and the people who live there are just squatters. Now, maybe that made sense to the people in that time, but to me, it's just about the craziest idea I've ever heard of. I find it difficult to put into words how much I reject that idea. Outrageous is a good word to me. Ridiculous is a good word. Crazy is a good word. And to me, it is the original all-time scam of the world. And it's also the epitome of cultural arrogance. But it's been used for 500 years, and much to my surprise, is still being used to support so-called legal decisions invalidating Aboriginal people's land rights in favor of modern governments. Now, as I was working on this, it dawned on me that this old story has a very personal connection to me. This photo was taken about 1910. That is my great-grandfather's family. Excuse me. That is my grandfather right there. So great-grandfather came to Iowa in 1874, and he bought some land. And he bought it from the railroad. So the railroad owned the land before he did. Well, how did the railroad get the land? Well, they got it from the federal government in exchange for laying track across the prairie. Well, how did the federal government get the land? They got it when Thomas Jefferson, then president, wrote a check for $15 million to Napoleon Bonaparte, and we got the Louisiana Purchase. So how did Napoleon Bonaparte get to own the land? He got it because this fellow, Cavalier de La Salle, paddled a canoe down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. And in 1862, he claimed the entire Mississippi River basin for France. And one source said he acquired for France the most fertile part of the North American continent. So when I actually researched this, I discovered that the land that was the beginning of my family's existence in North America, the ownership chain goes all the way back to this crazy doctrine of discovery and to this French guy paddling his canoe down the Mississippi River. So the doctrine of discovery is still having a force in our modern world. So much to my delight, I discovered in my little research project that in recent years the doctrine of discovery has been severely condemned as socially unjust, racist, and in violation of basic fundamental human rights. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has called the doctrine of discovery the foundation of the violation of indigenous peoples' human rights. The Unitarian Universalist Association passed a resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery, calling for its elimination. The Presbyterian Church in 2016 called on members of the church to confess the church's complicity and repudiate the doctrine of discovery. In 2016, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America described it as an improper mixing of the power of the church and the power of the sword. The Episcopal Church and the Reformed Church of America have made similar recent statements about this. And on November 3rd, 2016, a group of 524 clergy publicly burned a copy of a specific papal bull underpinning the doctrine of discovery. And they did that as a part of the Standing Rock Pipeline protests. So these two things, the idea that we were converting indigenous people to Christianity and the doctrine of discovery and this Treaty of Tordesillas, these two things have allowed European nations and other nations for 500 years to pretend that what they did, colonizing foreign lands, was legal and morally right. So I now have a much better understanding of why indigenous people to this day seem to continue to lose court cases, because this old idea is incorporated into our legal system as legal precedent. So that's the end of my little story, but it's certainly not the end of the story, because this is still going on in the world today. So the question remains, who owns the land?